Welcome to EB-5 Investment Voice, where attorney insights intersects with immigration investments. If you are a foreign investor, domestic fund manager, or enterprising entrepreneur and want to get the most out of the EB-5 program, you have come to the right place. I'm Mark Deal, and I'll be your co-host on this journey. I'm joined by your host, Mona Shaw, and other attorneys at Mona Shaw and Associates, as well as immigration leaders from around the world. So let's get into EB-5 Investment Voice. Mona, we've been doing this podcast, for over 7 years now. And in that time, we have had IIUSA on probably more than any other organization. Why is that?
Well, that's true. That's very true, Mark. But because IIUSA have so much to do within the EB-5 industry, and we've discussed this umpteen times about how much has happened over the last few years, and in particular since 2019 to date. And if we really want to stay abreast of what's going on up on the Hill and within the EB-5 community, whether it's legislative, whether there's litigation, whether there's just some major changes overseas, which is impacting the industry and impacting the program, there really is only one, I won't like to say legitimate because there are other legitimate sources, but one authentic source, and it's IIUSA.
You're right, Mona. And joining us on today's episode, we welcome back Aaron Grau. Aaron, welcome back once again to EB-5 Investment Voice.
Thank you once again for having me. Pleasure. I hope you guys continue to do this. I'll be able to be on a couple more.
I'm sure you'll be more than a couple more with all the activity. Aaron, a lot of the listeners probably think that after we had that legislation last year from Congress and we had lots and lots of talk about it, that IIUSA has gone to sleep. Is that the case?
No, but wow, what a softball question. Thank you. No, we've definitely not gone to sleep. In fact, even before and during and certainly after we were working on the reauthorization for the Regional Center program, our messaging had always been, this is our work to establish the foundation for the program. Once we have that foundation in place, there's a lot more work to do, not the least of which is the pursuit of more visas in whatever form that takes. And of course, we can't sit on our laurels. In 2026, 2027, we've got another reauthorization conversation coming up, and you can never be prepared too soon. So we've been doing a lot of work to set the groundwork for that as well. So there's no rest for the weary, and we have not been asleep for sure.
Well, I'd like to just point out that IIUSA is our preeminent advocate for the program on the Hill, which is so important, and we'll come to that. But in addition, IIUSA do other things. We educate people, especially on all of the changes and the updates. There's, of course, we discuss and we work on litigation. And IIUSA have been part of litigation just recently, correct?
We have. Recent is a relative term, but we were a plaintiff on what folks colloquially refer to as the Bering case. It was the lawsuit that was filed in response to what ultimately became USCIS's legal error in its determination to require all regional centers to reauthorize. That, of course, would have been a huge setback after a huge accomplishment of actually getting the reauthorization. And so IIUSA's participation, along with the other plaintiffs, initially as an amicus and then afterwards as a plaintiff, was something that rightly took a lot of time and attention, but we're glad that we were there for it and we're glad we participated.
Do we have any other upcoming litigation planned?
We participated also as an amicus in another case filed in the District Court of the District of Columbia that challenges the protocols by which USCIS processes 526 applications. We worked closely with Ron Klasko and his appellate group to develop the amicus brief. And so we're hopeful that we will see some movement there and perhaps some outcomes that will inure to the benefit of all investors and the industry. But that is another case, and we're always examining opportunities and trying to best allocate our resources.
So who makes the decision, Aaron, as to what cases you're going to litigate on?
It is collective. Oftentimes, an idea will be presented to me, and I will work through it with the board of directors and our leadership to get an understanding as to whether pursuing the litigation is in the association's best interest, whether it aligns with our mission and vision. After that, to the extent to which our members actually support the litigation. And then the final analysis is the extent to which we can afford to participate from a time perspective or financial perspective. Fortunately, there are those in the industry with whom we often participate who recognize our nonprofit status and are able to help underwrite these activities so that IIUSA doesn't have to dig deep into its pockets for the purposes of litigation, because it can get expensive. So it's a collective effort.
Would you think there's going to be any movement on smaller pieces of litigation? Like, for example, there's a lot going on under the floorboards relating to the DeSantis legislation on Chinese property ownership, because although that doesn't directly affect EB-5, indirectly it does.
I don't know of any litigation yet that's been filed pursuant to the DeSantis legislation. In general, the comments that I've given to members and to press is that any piece of legislation will have unintended consequences. There's really just no avoiding it. And the extent to which those unintended consequences can be avoided, they should. And in this particular case, if they weren't aware beforehand, policymakers certainly were aware after that a huge unintended consequence of this particular piece of legislation would deny ownership of property to Chinese investors, among others, which in turn would incredibly negatively impact EB-5's ability to create jobs. And as we're facing all sorts of economic headwinds, not the least of which is inflation and surely the increase in cost of capital, jobs are going to feel a pinch. It's not a good idea for an avoidable unintended consequence to take a swipe at those priorities.
It's so interesting. This is such a small program, but it's so huge. It has tentacles reach everywhere. And right now, I know across the board, we're seeing a big surge in projects coming forward, maybe because of the high interest rates, possibly also because of the additional visas or the visa carve-outs, which is bringing China and other backlog countries back. But what is really important, I feel, is that an industry trade association like IIUSA is there, which is trying to cover all the many different tentacles, all the reverberations, consequences, the legislation, etc. Don't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. It's amazing to consider everything that the association does, all the programming that it has, but it's all important. We're not only reactive to initiatives and policy conversations from the Hill or Tallahassee or Austin, Texas, or anywhere. We're also proactive. We're actively exploring and softening markets abroad so that our members have opportunities to identify new investors from new markets.
I was about to ask you about that.
Yeah.
So last week we had Sam Odani on the show, who has been tracing around Asia for the last few weeks, and he wanted to give us an update as to what the markets were and how COVID had affected everybody. And yes, there is definitely an interest, but what we are finding, and I think we're finding this throughout the industry, and I think you're going to also say that you're finding this on the Hill, is there's a lot of new people, which inevitably means there's a lot of new education required.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, we have a new bill, and before long, I imagine USCIS will come around to developing new regulations. I don't know in what format or on what timeline, but the new legislation, the new bill, the new law, I guess I should say, as well as whatever new regulations come around, they will all require bootstrap and education and re-education about how the program works and how it's working now as opposed to how it was working before the law. So a lot of what we do when we go to foreign markets is education, plain and simple. Panels that include experts from EB-5 and IIUSA's membership, talking expressly about new topics, what's different, what folks need to understand and take into consideration, what due diligence means under the new program. So Yeah, there's no doubt about it, Mona. Education is a big part of what IIUSA does.
I've been out with you and the team on the Hill when you're trying to do political outreach and educate the congressional staff, because that's really who you do need to educate, right? It's the staff at the moment who actually inform the congressional bodies, and they're the ones, the sort of the grassroots policies that you do.
I've always found it fascinating. And some people would look at what we do on Capitol Hill as incredibly rote and mundane and repetitive. The truth of the matter is, if you peel the onion back just one layer, it's actually not at all. It is the quintessential part of democracy that's so critical to assuring that good public policy makes its way to the surface. And if you take a moment and you think, well, we don't have to worry about our reauthorization until 2026 or 2027, when people will start turning their attention to the program, I would say that's entirely wrong. And the work that you did on Capitol Hill with us and the other members was very simply to educate policymakers and their staff about what is the EB-5 visa, what role does the regional center play, and specifically what role do those entities play in their district or in their state. Because the last question that we want to answer in 2026 and 2027, when we go to reauthorize this program, is, I'm sorry, what is EB-5? Can you explain that to me? That would be the absolute worst case scenario. If we're trying to push a rock up that hill, that late in the game, we're too far behind the 8 ball to make any meaningful policy changes in the next reauthorization.
Yeah. And other than going out and meeting with the staff, how else do you actually envisage really educating?
You know what? We have developed a protocol and we're looking forward to executing it on adding EB-5 as an agenda item to a congressional caucus.
Interesting.
A congression, and for those who don't know, a caucus, they form primarily within the House of Representatives as opposed to the U.S. Senate. And it is a group of members of Congress who get together to further a particular interest or a particular topic or issue. And there are caucuses that address just about everything under the sun. There is a caucus to address the steel industry. There's a caucus to address breast cancer. There's a caucus to address agricultural interests. You name it, and there's a group of policymakers that get together to discuss it and further the agenda that supports that issue.
Well, Aaron, let me ask you, although I think I probably already know the answer to this one. You mentioned there is a group of policymakers on almost every issue. Is there any glaring oversights or anything that is missing?
What there isn't is a caucus dedicated exclusively to EB-5, or what's more likely, a economic development caucus or a foreign investment caucus, both of which exist, that have EB-5 as part of their agenda and part of their priorities. Once IIUSA is able to connect the dots and work with members of Congress to get EB-5 as part of a caucus agenda, we begin to expand our audience on Capitol Hill among policymakers 10, 20, 50-fold. And with one meeting or congressional briefing, we'll be able to educate the number of staffers that it would normally take 30 meetings or 40 meetings to accomplish. So it's an interesting tactic. It's one that can bear a lot of fruit. It's one that requires a lot of shoe leather, but all the pieces are in place. And I think that as this Congress settles in and maybe pushes things like the debt limit off its plate, hopefully knock on wood in a good way, we'll have more of an opportunity to focus on congressional briefings pursuant to that strategy.
And you heard it first, right here on EB-5 Investment Voice.
You heard it here first.
No, that's really good, Aaron. And I know that we are all so disappointed on so many fronts right now. We're excited and yet disappointed. And I think the disappointment is coming from USCIS's, not just their stakeholder meeting, but their real lack of being able to push this program forward. They seem to be a hurdle at every stage. And last time you were on the show, you did voice your opinion about moving the project side of EB-5 to perhaps a different department, say the Department of Commerce or elsewhere. Do you think you're going to continue advocating the same stance?
Yeah, I am. It's possible that leadership or or my own revelations can curtail that. But this is the way, especially after the last USCIS quote engagement session.
Oh, don't get me started.
What I've come to believe is that USCIS is simply not constructed to handle EB-5. It's not in their DNA. The only way for a successful program to remain successful in that instance is if there is a wholehearted change of attitude within the Department of Homeland Security from its leadership, or something creative has to happen down below. But the definition of insanity, right? The doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, couldn't be more appropriate here. And this last engagement session proved that to me. The notion that there was going to be something different that happened and all of us believing it again, only to be incredibly disappointed when it didn't happen again, was just proof positive that something's got to change. There's got to be some sort of writ large change of direction managed by DHS's leadership, or there has to be some sort of push for a creative or different approach to managing this project. And if it happens to be that creative solution is to have a different agency involved to help CIS address the complicated realities of economic development programming, well, let's explore that. It's time to explore that.
Aaron, I've been advocating this for years. My belief has come from a slightly different standpoint. You're looking at it from more of a macro vision. The way I see it has a lot to do in terms of, for example, staffing. We have had problems over the years finding the right staff who fit in with EB-5 because EB-5 is so nuanced. It's not immigration law. It's not corporate law. It's not securities. It's a blend of all three with a little portion of other areas, perhaps foreign understanding and all of that stuff thrown in. And getting the right temperament has not been easy. And I can tell you, we have struggled when we've gone into the immigration community itself, when we're talking about the actual project side. I'm not talking about the immigration side. So if that is the case with practitioners, it can only be the case with USCIS.
You make a great point, Mona. You make a really great point with regards to capacity. And I cannot take credit for what I'm about to share, but anybody can go online and find it for themselves. Suzanne Lazecki, who is a genius in her own right, pointed out to us the other day that USCIS actually has job postings on USA Jobs, which is the federal government's job portal. So there are job descriptions for the adjudicators that CIS is seeking. And if you read through what they're asking for, if you read through the required qualifications, nowhere in that qualification description is anything about an expertise, let alone a knowledge or even basic understanding of economic development. It just doesn't exist in the people that they're looking to bring on. And without that, to your point again, you are creating a situation where the capacity simply doesn't exist. You could have 100 people, 200, 500 people ready to do God's work in implementing EB-5, but if none of them have an understanding of economic development or its realities, what's the point?
Yeah. And at this point, more than a visa wait, I think what disappoints new investors putting money into legitimate projects and big projects and projects in rural areas where there previously wasn't an interest is the fact that USCIS is so unpredictable in their adjudications, their timeline, their adjudications, the way they handle things. I mean, stupidity. I can't tell you, Aaron. They lose boxes and boxes of cases. They can't be digitalized. They can't understand certain concepts which we have put out in clear terminology. If it's not easy to understand, they just don't get it. It's really frustrating.
Yeah, it is. And look, I want to emphasize a couple of other points here. One is this is an incredibly complicated program, and we shouldn't fault the folks at CIS for not getting their head around it the way practitioners have their heads around it. It's not easy stuff. That's number one. Number two is Whether we as taxpayers like it or not, bureaucracy has a role to play in our society. It's an important element of our government. And I know that that is counterintuitive to what a lot of people think and believe or believe should be the case. But that bureaucracy enables consistency, if you will, among work that is done at the federal level or the state level or the county level or the city level that's actually important to the government's services equity, if you will. So I don't want to dispossess bureaucracy. I don't want to say that it absolutely must go away. That's not the case. It has a role to play. However, when the bureaucracy and the stability that it offers our governance becomes a hindrance to the governance such that congressional intent or a city council's intent is no longer being met, then a change needs to happen.
Yeah.
And that's where we are. That's where we are.
Well, here's a direct consequence of some of the idiotic decisions that USCIS are doing in projects across the board. There are people who've invested. The projects themselves have relied on that investment, and they've gone out and they've taken commitments and they've moved their project forward, expecting that they would have the EB-5 money for at least 5 years. Then something happens and the investor wants to withdraw. The investor cannot withdraw his money because the capital has already been implemented and it's going to come back in due time. The investor then, which is the latest trend, has started to litigate. The litigation costs the project money. That money is something which takes that project away from its goals. So these are unintended perhaps consequences, but it's also perhaps foreseeable of, idiotic decisions by USCIS.
Yeah. I would agree with everything that you're saying. I would only stop short of calling them idiotic. Unfortunately, if we were to flip the script and we were looking at it from USCIS's perspective, they would say to us, it's not idiotic at all. It's exactly what we should be doing. It's exactly what we need to be doing, and we're doing it as best we can. And all of that, from their perspective, is 100% true. The problem is that they have no ability to flip the script themselves and understand it from our perspective. And that's the rub. There's just a complete disconnect between the reality of the operations of the bureaucracy and the reality that we face every day when it comes to immigration protocols for investors and for, establishing economic development programs. That disconnect needs to be fixed, because if it's not, congressional intent will not be met. And that is a profound error in governance that cannot stand. And not only because of the academic argument there, but because people are suffering. I mean, people are putting everything they have on the line to move to the United States.
Yeah.
And the United States is unable to meet its obligations and the promises that it makes under this program. That's a problem.
As we heard from Sam last week and from Patrick the week before, the fact that so many programs in Europe are closing or have closed, like the Irish program, the Portuguese program, and of course the changes in the Caribbean, we are seeing a lot more interest in investors coming into the United States and looking at EB-5. So I think that this is a really good opportunity, Aaron.
I agree. I mean, the EB-5 visa remains one of the most attractive and the strongest in the world to immigrant investors. I have to take a step back and remember the forest for the trees. As executive director, it's my job to look as far down the road as I can to anticipate opportunities and problems that the association has and to begin to address them in a productive way as soon as possible. It's also my job to tackle tough issues that are in front of us right now. And in that process, even I overlook the very positive reality that the reauthorization has given our industry. And that is this, that the United States Congress gave the EB-5 program, the Regional Center program, its unconditional blessing, and that it is a good program for the country and they wanted it in place for a long time. And so it gave us a framework and a stable foundation all the way through 2027. And we intend to build on that for the entire time. Are there issues? Yeah, there's issues. Will there always be issues? Yeah, there will always be issues. And the association will always be here to address them. We get caught up in talking about the issues and the consternation that it causes. But I don't think any of us should overlook the fact that this program is real. It really works. It develops results, and Congress likes it. It doesn't just like it, it loves it. And there is really no reason for us to think that the program is going to go away. We just have some issues to work out to make sure it works better.
Well, Aaron, you really pointed out that IIUSA is not only reactive to tough issues our industry is feeling right now, but proactive by, as you said, looking down the road and addressing potential issues and get ahead of problems before they're really problematic. And Aaron, for that, we thank you for your service, and thank you once again for coming on EB-5 Investment Voice.
I look forward to being with you guys again very soon.
Thank you for being with us today on EB-5 Investment Voice. The topics presented in this podcast is informational in nature and is not to be taken as specific legal advice. If you have questions on the topics presented in this episode or other investment immigration needs, please contact Mona Shaw and Associates. Mona and her attorney staff can be reached at mshawlaw.com. That's mshawlaw.com. Make sure you don't miss our next episode focusing on a different aspect of the EB-5 program by subscribing to the podcast. While you're at it, leave us a rating on iTunes. If you really found this episode valuable, share it with someone else that could benefit from this information. Until then, I'll see you on the next episode of EB-5 Investment Voice.